How the indigenous people of the Caribbean survived colonization. In this episode, you will learn about the three primary indigenous tribes in the Caribbean, the Kalinago, the Garifuna, and the Taino, and how they have influenced Caribbean culture markedly in its cuisine and how these communities live today. After 2 weeks of diving deep into Haitian history, culture, and cuisine, we are now moving on to the larger Caribbean as we get ready to celebrate Caribbean American Heritage Month in June. I'll be honest, as someone with partial Haitian heritage, I found the last two episodes emotionally draining and I am more than ready to move on. If you think about the ethnicity of most Caribbean people, who first comes to mind? Most likely a Black person of African ancestry, right? For the average person, African descended people are the primary ethnicity in the Caribbean. But the Caribbean is one of the most ethnically diverse areas of the entire world, with people having the most mixed ethnicities, myself included. Due to the history with both slavery and colonization, the ethnicities of Caribbean people span the globe, from Indonesia, China, and India to West Africa and the Middle East. But before any of these people came, the Caribbean had indigenous tribes. While different islands will have different indigenous histories, today we will focus on the largest indigenous tribes of the Caribbean, the Kalinago, the Garifuna, and the Taino. Welcome to Heritage Food Stories, Season 2, Episode 5, How the Indigenous People of the Caribbean Survived Colonization. I'm your host, Chef Mireille, chef, food historian, and culinary storyteller, with a lifelong passion for exploring global cuisines and the stories behind the food we eat. Remember, today's episode you could also view on YouTube or read it as a Substack article. Before we dive deep into today's episode, can you do me a favor? Hit that like button and let's start a conversation in the comments. Not to make this all about me, but Dominica is another island I have a personal connection to. My grandmother came from Dominica, home to the largest remaining indigenous population in the Caribbean. So this topic is as personal to me as the episode on Haiti. The Kalinago are one of the last surviving indigenous peoples in the Caribbean to maintain a continuous community on their ancestral land. Today, roughly 3,000 people live in the protected Kalinago territory on the eastern coast of Dominica, with the wider Kalinago population estimated closer to 4,000. While there are smaller Kalinago-descended populations on islands like St. Vincent, Dominica remains the primary center of Kalinago culture today. They make up roughly 3 to 4% of Dominica's population and remain a vibrant part of the island's culture, cuisine, and identity. The Kalinago territory have local self-governance, electing both the Kalinago chief and council representation. In 2023, Dominica elected Sylvanie Burton as president, the country's first female president and first Kalinago president. Now, many of you may know them by the name Carib. It's important to know the reason behind the name switch. It is not just a matter of reclaiming their name and their heritage. Calling them Kalinago instead of Carib is about returning their stolen dignity and false narratives written by colonizers. The Carib name is rooted in bias and the evils of colonization, marked by centuries of dehumanization. Too many people to this day continue to use the term Carib in history books and discussions about the Kalinago. But we are not going to do that. When Christopher Columbus reached Dominica on November 3rd, 1493, during his second voyage, he was unable to establish control over the island because of both the rugged terrain and the fierce resistance of the Kalinago people of Waitakabuli, the Kalinago name for Dominica. For years, many history books repeated the story that Columbus landed on Dominica. More recent historical interpretations suggest he may instead have landed nearby on Marie Galante while scouting the island. Because the Kalinago resisted conquest far more aggressively than some other indigenous groups Columbus had encountered, Spanish chroniclers increasingly portrayed them as violent cannibals. Historians now recognize that accusations of cannibalism were often weaponized to justify conquest, enslavement, and genocide throughout the Caribbean. Despite centuries of research, archaeological evidence supporting widespread ritual cannibalism among the Kalinago remains weak and highly debated. Dominica was the last island to be colonized. For 200 years, it was a neutral island, serving as a landing port, but the Europeans were not able to conquer the Kalinago. During this time, the island was used for refueling and a trading port, as the Kalinago did trade with the Europeans. The first settlement did not occur until the 1690s, and Dominica did not become a French territory until 1727. While the Kalinago were never enslaved on the island like the indigenous of other Caribbean islands, they were pushed further inland. The island was eventually colonized twice by both the French and the English until England finally obtained permanent control in 1805. In 1903, Kalinago Territory, then known as Carib Territory, was established with 8 villages. They elect their own chief and representative in the House of Assembly. There was no gold or precious metals on the island, but the Kalinago were prepared to protect their island, which they called Waitukubuli, meaning tall is her body. The nature island of the Caribbean was their home to waterfalls like Trafalgar and the Emerald Pool, mineral hot springs, and the second largest boiling lake in the world. Fertile land that grew cassava, taro, plantain, cacao, mango, pineapple, passion fruit, and guava. They knew exactly what they were fighting for. Here's a fun fact. The Pirates of the Caribbean movie franchise was filmed in Dominica. Back to today's topic. Unlike the Taino populations Columbus encountered on islands like Hispaniola, the Kalinago developed a reputation as fierce warriors and skilled seafarers. They used the mountainous terrain to their advantage and resisted European domination for centuries. Spanish accounts often portrayed them as savages because the Kalinago refused submission. So when did the Kalinago first arrive in the Caribbean? Archaeological evidence suggests that earlier indigenous groups migrated from South America into the Lesser Antilles thousands of years ago. Ancestors of the Kalinago likely arrived in the Lesser Antilles around 1200. Earlier groups, such as the Ortoroid peoples, had already introduced crops like cassava and sweet potato long before. One of the most controversial parts of Caribbean history involves the relationship between the Kalinago and the Taino. Some historical accounts claim the Kalinago displaced Taino communities in parts of the Lesser Antilles and sometimes took Taino women as wives after warfare. However, historians continue to debate how widespread or violent these interactions actually were, and many older colonial accounts exaggerated conflict between indigenous groups. Although the original island Carib language largely disappeared over time, Kalinago culture survives through oral history, craft traditions, cuisine, canoe building, basket weaving, music, dance, and cultural preservation efforts. Now the Garifuna. The Garifuna are descendants of the Kalinago. They are an Afro-Indigenous people who live primarily in Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala today. The most widely accepted historical account is that enslaved Africans escaped or survived the shipwreck near St. Vincent during the 1600s and were taken in by the Kalinago communities there. Over time, African and Kalinago communities intermarried and developed a distinct shared culture. The Garifuna absorbed influences from both worlds. West African drumming and dance traditions merged with Kalinago seafaring knowledge, foodways, and spiritual practices. The Garifuna language itself, which is still spoken today, is rooted primarily in Arawakan languages with influences from Caribbean, African, French, and European languages. History books will often refer to them as Black Caribs, but most Garifuna people reject that colonial terminology today. The Garifuna Kalinago lived in peaceful coexistence with the Europeans until 1769, when a regiment was taken hostage after crossing into indigenous land. Relations between the Garifuna Kalinago communities and the British deteriorated as British plantation expansion intensified in St. Vincent. The First Carib War lasted from 1769 to 1773 under the leadership of Joseph Chatoyer, who remains a national hero in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Garifuna Kalinago held out despite disease and starvation, the British suffering under disease, incompetence, and ineffectual defense led to a peace treaty signed in 1773 delineating boundaries. By 1795, the British were no longer even pretending to honor the treaty, as they set up sugar plantations in St. Vincent. The Second Carib War began in 1795. After Chatoyer was killed in battle, British forces eventually defeated the Garifuna resistance. Fearing further revolts, the Garifuna Kalinago, with more African features, were exiled to Roatan in Honduras, while the ones with more indigenous features were allowed to stay in St. Vincent. In 1797, the British deported more than 5,000 Garifuna from St. Vincent to Roatan. Nearly half died during deportation, imprisonment, and transport. From there, Garifuna communities spread along the Caribbean coast of Central America. Today, there are an estimated 300,000 to 600,000 Garifuna people worldwide, including large diaspora communities in New York City, especially in the Bronx. Garifuna music, drumming, dance, language, and oral traditions were recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. The Arawakan tribes who migrated from northern South America to the Caribbean were divided into three Taino tribes. The classic Taino were on Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, as well as Puerto Rico. Western Taino were in Cuba, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Eastern Taino were in the northern Lesser Antilles, including Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, and the Virgin Islands. A few additional tribes, such as the Tequesta and Calusa, also migrated to Florida. The Taino were highly skilled agriculturists and seafarers. Cassava was central to their diet and culture. They cultivated cassava, sweet potatoes, corn, peanuts, peppers, and tropical fruits, while also fishing extensively throughout the Caribbean. The Taino were also known for canoe building, pottery, cotton weaving, and sophisticated social organization. By the time Columbus arrived, they were well organized socially and politically, with areas defined by chiefdoms known as caciques. Some of these caciques were small villages, but some had as much as several thousand residents. Life was built around community, spirituality, agriculture, and nature. Their migration patterns had largely been shaped by their sometimes contentious relationship with the more aggressive Kalinago. When the Spanish arrived, the Taino were the largest indigenous group in the Caribbean, with some estimates being as high as 2 million. Forced labor, warfare, famine, displacement, and European diseases devastated the indigenous population to just a few thousand. Enslavement under the encomienda system forced many Taino into brutal labor in mines and plantations. The conditions for slaves, whether the indigenous or the Africans, in the Spanish-controlled islands were the worst in the entire Caribbean. Starvation and torture were commonplace. For many years, people repeated the myth that the Taino became extinct. But that narrative ignores centuries of survival through cultural continuity and mixed ancestry. Many Taino descendants survived through intermarriage with Africans and Europeans, and Taino ancestry remains common throughout the Caribbean, especially in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Today, Taino culture is celebrated with language reconstruction, spirituality, music, dance, ceramics, and the cuisine, which lives on. Indigenous Caribbean cuisine was rooted in agriculture, fishing, preservation, and survival. Cassava was the foundation of indigenous Caribbean diets because it could grow in tropical climates and be processed into bread, porridges, drinks, desserts, and flour. Root vegetables like cassava, sweet potato, yams, and taro remain staples throughout Caribbean cooking today. Corn, coconut, cacao, peppers, herbs, seafood, and smoked meats also formed important parts of indigenous Caribbean foodways. Here are a few Caribbean foods deeply connected to indigenous Caribbean history. Cocoa tea. Originally drunk as a medicinal elixir by the indigenous with spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and bay leaf, this Caribbean style hot cocoa is now ubiquitous throughout Caribbean countries. Fishere, an aromatic Garifuna stew of fish, cassava, and plantain simmered in coconut milk, popular in Belize and Honduras. Cassava bread. Cassava bread exists throughout the Caribbean in many forms. Thin, crisp cassava flatbreads remain especially important in indigenous communities across Dominica, St. Vincent, Guyana, and Belize. A thin, crispy, unleavened flatbread enjoyed with morning coffee, bush tea, or cocoa tea. Kanki, Konki, Dakana, Baimi, going by different names on different islands. There are variations of these steamed puddings made throughout the Caribbean, made with things like sweet potato, plantain, cassava, or cornmeal mixed with coconut and spices, then wrapped in banana leaves and boiled. These are often enjoyed as dessert, breakfast, side dish, or snack. Pan de yuca. Cassava is the primary food item in the indigenous cultures of the Caribbean, one of the most versatile food items in the world. Recipes with cassava are eaten by Caribbean people in many different ways. This pan de yuca is Honduras's version of what is known as cassava pone in other Caribbean countries, a gluten-free bread made with cassava and coconut, with a texture that is part bread and part pudding. Machuca. There are derivatives of African fufu throughout the Caribbean. Garifuna cuisine has machuca, which is made with both green and ripe plantain and most commonly eaten with soups and stews. Barbecue. The English word barbecue comes from the Taino word barbacoa. The Taino use raised wooden structures over fire pits to smoke and preserve meat and fish, techniques that later influenced barbecue traditions throughout the Americas, including the infamous Jamaican jerk cooking. This was used to both give the meat flavor and preserve the meat. Jamaica's jerk chicken came out of this indigenous barbecue tradition. So the next time you're enjoying a hot steaming mug of cocoa tea with pan de yuca or a plate of jerk chicken, remember the indigenous Caribbean people whose food traditions helped shape Caribbean cuisine. Thank you for joining me today. For subscriber-only recipes, including fish serré, consider upgrading to a paid subscription. Other free recipes and resources will be available in the show notes. You can explore over 1,000 recipes from around the world on my website, linked in the show notes. Whether you're cooking tonight or just curious, there's something there for you. I'm Chef Mireille. See you next time.